I'm Doran Barton. I work at Bluehost. We got these cool jerseys for some of us. I'm a senior developer there. We are hiring for a variety of jobs. Some deal with Perl. If you're a mad Python person, I know our sysadmins would love to talk to you because they're doing some stuff with OpenStack. And it's very exciting. We're on the bleeding edge of that. Some of you work at Bluehost. So, yay. Go you. So this is really a very introductory topic, but what I want to talk about is the way object-oriented programming can be done in Perl. And we're going to talk about blessed hashes. We're going to talk about inside-out objects. And I'm going to finish up talking about meta-objects. And so that's where we'll go from there. OK, so first of all, before Perl 5, there really wasn't a good way to do object-oriented programming in Perl. Perl was purely procedural. It was great for sysadmins writing sysadmin-y type scripts. Perl 5 was introduced 1996, 97, and it provided a handy little bless function that allowed you to take your hashes and turn them into objects. This was limited, but it provided some fundamental characteristics of object-oriented programming. First of all, you got inheritance. The idea that you can declare a package or a class as being A, and then you can create another one that says it inherits all the characteristics of A. We'll call that B. And so you can create child classes, subclasses, whatever you want to call them. It also provided the concept of encapsulation. And encapsulation, when you're talking about object-oriented programming, encapsulation means that you have an object, and through that object you can get to data that belongs to that object, and you can get to code or methods that belong to that object. So the Perl 5 system provides that. And there's very limited overloading with the very first implementation of objects in Perl. Overloading is the idea that you can change the way that operators like plus, minus, divide, those kind of things, the way that they work, because most of the time you do a 5 divided by 2. That's easy because both sides of it are just numbers, and Perl recognizes that. But if you say object A divided by object B, you're going to get some weird results. But with the overloading, you can actually say when you have two objects, or you have an object and another scalar value, this is how I want you to do it. So you can write code to handle that. That's what overloading does. So what is not implemented in the Perl 5? Well, I put overloading as a star there. So full overloading, I put an asterisk there because there's an overload pragma that has been introduced since Perl 5 was brand new that allows you to do most of what you'd want to do with operator overloading. Class privacy. This is probably the biggest complaint about Perl's object system. In a good object-oriented language, you can define variables inside your class as either being public or private. And private objects, you want them to be private. You don't want them to be accessed unless you provide a mechanism for that to happen. Perl, your object is a hash. And if the programmer didn't provide a method for accessing the data, well, guess what? You can just access it if you know the hash key. So it's pretty easy to get around that. There's not any privacy really. Polymorphism. This is something that Perl doesn't do at all. And if you're doing things in Java or C++, polymorphism is the idea that you can have a function called, say, x. We'll go easy here. You can have a function called x that actually runs different code depending on what arguments you pass to it, what types of arguments you pass to it. Now you say, well, in Perl, you could just say, let's look at the objects that are passed to us and then run different code based on what gets passed to us. But in pure polymorphism, you can actually declare each variable, each method separately by the types of arguments that are passed to it. And so Perl doesn't give you that. Other object-oriented languages do. Another big problem with Perl, compared to other languages, is that it is weakly typed. So it's difficult to. That's one of the reasons why it's difficult to do the polymorphism, is because your data types are, well, you have scalars, you have lists, and you have hashes, and that's about it. There's other languages give you integers, floating point numbers, strings, and then anything else that you define. So some people would argue that Perl is deficient because it lacks strong types. So let's look at an example of a vanilla Perl 5 object. We have a package called foo. Has anybody ever called a package called foo, or is it just me? Okay, foo. First thing we see there is the declaration of the package. This is our object class. Next, we have a constructor. This is the code that's going to create the object. And the thing that kind of differentiates a object method from other things is the fact that the first thing the object receives is a reference to the class. The method receives the object itself. And so in many cases, people will call this myself. So it'll be $self in there. And so that's how you access the object's data and other methods. And then here's an additional constructor parameter. And in this case, the constructor, we're passing in the name of the object here. And then down here, we bless it. Bless is what makes a hash into an object. And I don't know why it's called bless. It could have been called anything. But Larry said, let's call it bless. And bless is just Perl magic for turning a hash into an object. Once you bless a hash, now you can access data through it. You can access methods that are associated with the package. So there's bless. Bless an anonymous hash into an object reference. And then here we add some data to the class. And then we return the reference to the object. Yes?
Question. Why do we have the class passed in on a new method? I mean, would this be any different if you said bless and then just put the word foo? I'm saying...
It would not be any different, but, yeah.
It allows the constructor to be inherited.
Yeah, it allows the constructor to be inherited.
So a subclass could have the class passed.
Because, yeah, if you're going to create a package called bar, and bar inherits from foo, you want the constructor to get bar if you're creating an instance of that subclass. So that creates, that produces the inheritance. Okay. So that's how you create an object using the Perl 5 blessed hashes. Let's look at how you use it. So you use the name of your class, the name of your package, foo, and then you create it with the constructor called new. So you say foo new, and you pass in this little parameter called 5, and you get back a scalar. It's a reference to the object, and we call it obj. And then the next call there is we're calling a method called print bar that is a method defined within the package. Okay, so that's very glossy, high-level look at the Perl 5 blessed hash objects. You want to learn more? There's a lot of stuff you can read about it. What I'm going to do now is go on to Insideout. We talked about some of the deficiencies of the Perl 5 object system, and many developers have recognized and tried to compensate for them.
And Insideout was one of those efforts. This was originally first popularized by Damian Conway, who the previous presenter mentioned. Damian Conway wrote a book called Perl Best Practices. It was released in 2006. And in that, he talks about some of the problems with the blessed hashes. He points out one of the biggest problems is privacy and enforcement of privacy. And he says, here's a way we can do it. And he came up with a cool... So this is basically Perl 5 objects plus privacy enforcement. He came up with a implementation called class STD. And this provides an exported subroutine called ident that provides a unique ID for objects. And so this is, every time you instantiate an object, you store like a unique ID for that object inside the object. And through that, you can access the data that is private to the object. But because that data, that ID, only exists in scope inside the object, code outside of the object can't access because it doesn't know what that unique ID is. So that's how he implements the privacy. There is a more recent, more feature-filled, more abstracted way of doing Insideout, and it's called Object Insideout. And it's pretty cool. I'll show you some examples of that. So here's an Insideout example using the class STD. So the first thing we do up there, it's very much like the Perl 5 objects. We declare the name of the package, the class. We're going to use class STD. And then we declare a couple of, they look like, variables. These are hashes that are outside of our methods. So these are, they belong to the package. And then in new, so let's say with this new constructor, we pass in the class. We also get a first name and a last name. And we bless. Now the bless does something interesting here. It creates an anonymous scalar and returns that. We're blessing the hash, but it does this thing here where we call ident, and that's our object ID. So every time that you create an instance of an Insideout object, it creates a unique ID for that. And then it stores the actual values that you pass in into these hashes that are scoped to the package. The key is that unique object ID. So you can actually have, go and create lots of different instances of this person object, and each time you do, it's going to store that data in this hash, but the key is going to be unique for each one. And then here's a getter. Get the first name. It returns the value stored in this hash, and the key is, our unique ID. So what's nice about this is, so you implement this, and somebody comes along and says, "Oh, this is Perl. I don't need to use our stupid get first name. I can just say object curly brackets first name and get it back, right?" No, it doesn't work. This is how it enforces privacy.
Ident class seems good.
I'm sorry?
You said ident class.
Is there a typo there?
Yes, there is. Should be ident self.
Yeah, so.
That looks great.
Up top in your new.
You're right. This should be ident class, ident self right here.
Okay, that makes sense.
What was that? Like suddenly I got a laser on the end of my finger. Okay. So other features of the class STD. Damien threw some magic in there so that you can create private methods. Private methods, allow you to call the methods only from within the class itself and not from outside. In the vanilla Perl 5 object world, the convention is, we'll just name our method beginning with an underscore, and then people will just know that it's private and they won't call it. But
I remember, I think one of the authors of the Programming Perl, the Llama book, they have a quote about, Perl doesn't want you to get out of its house because it has a gun. It just wants you, it assumes you will get out because you were asked nicely. So, but this gives you a gun, basically, to say, I want this stuff to be private. So you get some magic here that automatically creates your getters and setters. You have some demolish and build methods that add some constructor shortcuts and destructor shortcuts and so forth. Let's look at the newer implementation of this. This is Object Inside-Out. Internal support for serialization. That's one problem if you start monkeying around and changing the way the blessed hashes work. Suddenly you have this idea that if you want to serialize, take a variable and convert it to some data structure that you're going to send off to another system, whether it's whatever. You're serializing it. You're creating something that's text safe or something like that. Object Inside-Out has internal support for that. Foreign class inheritance. So you create an Object Inside-Out class, and you want to inherit from something like datetime, which is not an Object Inside-Out object. It'll work. So you don't need to worry about that. There's some shortcuts for commonly done object mechanisms. We'll talk about that and show some examples of that. Here we go. So first of all, you declare your class, and then you create a scope with the curly brackets. You say use Object Inside-Out. So now we have this my class package or class, and here we have my a subclass. And the way that we inherit in here is we say use Object Inside-Out, and then we pass in a list of what we want to inherit from. Pretty simple. And then some other special things you can do when you're declaring your data, your class variables. You can say, this my colors, it's a list, is a field, and I want a get colors as a getter. So these little colon strings are attributes that basically generate code for you, which is kind of handy, because in the Perl 5, vanilla Perl 5 object world, blessed hashes, you've got to write every getter and setter. Things like this just make it easy. And we'll see that with the next iteration of the meta-objects, it takes it 10 times further. So here we have, here's a quick and easy way to make something read-only. Just use this read-only attribute. It's kind of cool. Okay. Moose objects. This is the meta object. This adds a whole bunch of missing features from other object-oriented languages. Classes are defined with metadata. We'll show you what that means. I know some of these guys that I work with over here are sick of hearing about metadata because they work with it all the time. But
I'm sorry. Someone had to go there.
And as I mentioned before, Moose provides a lot of automation that reduces the amount of actual coding that you have to do. But the biggest complaint that you hear about Moose is it's slow. People say, well, it's only a startup that's slow. So if you're running in a server environment, not like the old days of CGI where you've spun up a Perl interpreter every single time a request came in. If you're running Mojolicious or Catalyst or something like that, you're not going to run Perl every time a request comes in. You're going to run it once. And that's when you take care of your Moose startup time. And then once you get past that, it's pretty fast. But it's still kind of slow. So that's one of the complaints about Moose. So let's look at an example of how you would create an object in Moose. And I think you'll notice right away, first of all, it's a lot easier to read than the old way of doing blessed hashes. We have a package. It's called person. We use Moose. it has a first name. And that first name is RW, read write. And it is a string. So we get some type checking here, which is kind of cool. It has a last name. It is read write, and it is a string. So this is similar to the package that we showed a little while ago in Insideout. So we declare a class variable as an attribute. This automatically produces getters and setters for you. You don't have to write your own code. I mean, you can. You don't have to. You get some type constraint, some validations. So, some other features of Moose. You can declare subroutines that run before, after, and around other code. So, you want to say every time that this class is instantiated as an object, I want you to run this code. And that's cool because now that code gets run every time another class that inherits from this one gets instantiated as well. Or around. You want to do something and you want to do some stuff before and after that something gets done. Moose makes it really easy. Roles are like interfaces, if you're familiar with other object-oriented languages. It's a way of saying, here, I want to define all the things that this package can do. You can implement that as a role, and then that's easily, put onto other classes. It's like inheritance, but it's value added. And then there's some great power in the override capabilities. But more importantly, Moose really leverages CPAN. I should say the Moose community has really leveraged and exploited CPAN. There are a ton of MooseX modules available on CPAN. So you can do all kinds of crazy stuff. Method signatures is something that was created outside of Moose. It gives you some keywords like method and func that you would use in place of sub. And it essentially gets rid of having to worry about, okay, this is an object method, this is a class method, so I need to make sure that my the first thing that I get in is self. So you don't need to declare that if you use method signatures. You get self. It's automatic, automagic. Autobox. Has anybody here used Autobox before? Okay, Curtis has used Autobox. Autobox is cool because now you can just take a string, my name is John Doe in double quotes, and you can treat it like an object. You can say string, arrow, upper, and that will uppercase the string. Autoboxing is cool. There's an Autobox module for Moose. And the declarative stuff lets you add some sugar and things like that. There's a lot of type constraints. So if you want to create an object and you want to type in there that's a date time. Date time is one of those really powerful CPAN modules that lets you work with dates and times. You can create a type constraint for date time in your class, and that makes sure that what you're passing in as a constructor variable or whatever is a date time. So that's kind of handy. Okay, so let's look at Moose versus our blessed hash Perl 5 objects. So over here on the left, we have our Moose. Use Moose, has last name, it's read write, it's a string. Done. Over on the right is the exact same code written in Perl 5, vanilla Perl 5 blessed hash code. And you can see there's not even any room for it over here. It kind of scrolls off the screen. But clearly, it means less typing for the programmer. Now, there's a cost involved. We talked about that. Moose is great, but it's slow. Alternatives sacrifice some of the features that Moose provides for speed. There's Moose, there's Mouse, Mouse XS, which implements some stuff in C for faster. There's Moo. Moo is probably the most popular one. There's Mo, And I seem to remember somebody wrote
There's in.
There's N.
as kind of a joke. I don't think it's really that useful, but it's there. You can use So let's look at some of the Moose-like modules that are available there. You can see, what they provide and what not. So Moose over there does all these things. Mouse does everything Moose does, but it doesn't provide a super or an augment or an inner. So these are ways of projecting code onto your class. I think inner does things like you want to run this inside another method. Moo just doesn't do confess and blessed. So otherwise, but it adds a few things. Mo does the bare minimum. It just has new, extends, and has. So if you just need a really bare minimum implementation of the meta objects, maybe Mo is what you need. Yes?
Is that grid available online? So let's say at a later time, I want to know which one to use.
Yes, we'll be uploading this YouTube video. No, I think it is. I don't think I wrote that myself.
YouTube, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think I wrote that myself. I think I just copied and pasted it, but that's a good question.
Yeah, there are times where it's like, maybe Mo would be better to use than Moose, because maybe Moose is overkill and really I just want the has and stuff, so, but, there's like
We did some stuff with Bluehost, and we did it with Moose. And in retrospect, I think we could have done everything we did with Moo. We would have been fine.
Number 2, clearly.
It can upgrade itself to Moose
Yeah.
when you need it.
Where's where it's at.
Moo is where it's at. Now, some things have happened in the Moose community. A couple of years ago, Stephen Little, who was the primary author of Moose, said, hey, I've got this great idea. We're going to put Moose in the Perl core. We'll call it P5 MOP, the meta-object protocol. And this was a movement to get Perl functionality into a future version of the Perl core. Well, he ran into a lot of difficulty doing that, and most notably from the core Perl developers. They were very resistant to the idea of doing this, mostly because of compatibility to old versions of Perl. And so there was a lot of resistance, and finally he said, forget it, I'm not going to do it. And at the Orlando Perl Workshop 2013, he gave a presentation, said, Perl isn't dead, it's a dead end. And I went to that presentation, and it was kind of a bummer. But his point was, just do it, feels good to you, and don't worry about it having to be Perl. But at the same time, he also announced that he was writing Mo. And Mo was basically, he was writing a whole new language that was Perl compatible, Perl 5 compatible, but it implemented the Perl 5 meta-object protocol in its core. So he's like forking Perl in a sense, but not really forking, but creating a Perl-like language that implemented this in its core. That was, 18 months ago. Since then, he's come up with the P5 MOP Redux, or redo, support for putting the meta-object protocol into the Perl core. Has come back, and they've come up with some different ways of doing it. And there is actually it's gaining momentum. I don't know what version we're actually going to see it in, but Curtis, you monitor the porters.
It's going to happen in 22 even. Beyond that, I couldn't say.
Okay, so it's still kind of on the horizon, but it's gaining momentum. Okay, now to come full circle. Stephen has mentioned that the new P5 MOP is going to implement its objects inside out. So that'll be interesting. And for more information, there's lots of information on Moose. The Modern Perl book, if anybody's seen that, who wrote that?
Modern Perl?
Chromatic.
Chromatic wrote that. And this is actually available for free as a PDF online, or you can give him your financial support and buy it from Amazon or whatever. But it does a really good job of going through the Moose and the meta-object ideas. Perl Best Practices by Damian Conway it's showing its age, but if you want to see how the Insideout stuff was initially brought to the community, it's there. The Object Insideout pod is great, and the Perl OBJ built-in, that comes with the Perl core, actually talks a little bit about Insideout and some other ways of doing, your standard Perl objects. So, how are we doing on time? Did I just...
It's been updated now to include Moose, I believe, as well.
Cool. Did I just zip through that really fast?
Yeah, you did.
Okay. So now is the time for you guys to ask questions, and I'll see if I can answer them. Yes?
How do some of these things interfere with mod Perl and things like that, where they're keeping Perl in the same state? Like the Insideout has some global. They were global to the package, but these have in between mod Perl that won't forget those. Is that?
No, I haven't seen anything like that. The biggest advantage of using these with mod Perl is that mod Perl, in the mod Perl environment, you're not as concerned about the startup overhead, because you start up your Perl processes when you start up your Apache server. So this is a win-win for mod Perl. Yes?
I guess I was wondering the same thing. So they get garbage collected at some point? Like
Yeah.
These objects that have unique keys, they disappear at some point.
Right. Yeah, in Perl, all you have to do is just delete your reference, and bam, it's gone. Any other questions? Yes?
Can you explain why it's called Inside Out? That terminology doesn't make sense.
No, I can't. I think it has to do with the fact that when you do stuff inside out, you're putting your variables in a scope that they can't be seen from the outside, and so you're leveraging that scoping mechanism in Perl, but there's still the data is still available through the object reference itself.
You're taking normally the inside of the object is the hash. Now you're taking that inside of the object and putting it out into the lexical scope instead of into the...
So it's still a blessed hash, but your code is referencing yet another hash that isn't in scope with the calling code. So that's probably why it's called Inside Out. That's my best guess, and it seems like Dave and Curtis agree with me. Okay, any other questions? All right, cool. Thank you.